Hi. This week we're going to be examining the pedagogy and the philosophy of Paulo Freire. You may know that his work has been used extensively, especially in the global south, to a lesser extent in the global north, but still evident there. Freire's most important work is known as the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. By now you've probably read the first chapter. If not, this would be a good time for you to read it. This lecture will be a good introduction to his pedagogy overall, but I think that reading that chapter will be a really helpful way to apply this as well. Freire began his work in Brazil, and it has spread, as I mentioned, around the world. Freire's work begins with a critique of education that is most commonly practiced. He critiqued it by calling it the banking concept of education. In essence, students were seen as empty vessels into which the adults, the teachers, poured knowledge. Okay, as you can see from this quote, the most beneficent view of that is that knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Okay, that's the conventional view that Freire is critiquing. We will, of course, recognize that from some of the earlier philosophies that we examined in this course. Now, in that Freire considered his pedagogy liberating, he was very key that the student should create their own identity, that it was common in conventional pedagogy for a student to identify with the oppressor, that in pouring the knowledge from a knowledgeable person into an empty person, right, that banking concept of education, the idea was sort of reproducing the knowledge that was being bestowed by the teacher. In this case, he was trying to replace that identity with a pedagogy of freedom. So let's look at that in a couple of examples. If we look at it from a feminist perspective, right, we're fairly familiar, I should say, with the idea of a woman trying to make it in a man's world, right? We see in this image, right, a woman wearing a pantsuit, trying to emulate the ways in which men work. We're certainly very well aware of the way that narrative has played out in politics, etc. So let's contrast that with an image that we're well aware of from Beyonce in Lemonade, right? Here we have a incredibly varied set of understandings of how it is that women can and should be in the world, and they are none of them necessarily emulating the way that men are in the world. So that as a way of self-determining their role, Beyonce is leading that way for many and encouraging women to make their own way in the world. Okay, we may look at that in another example when it comes to disability. You may be familiar with the concept of ableism. Okay, Tom Hare wrote about ableism, and he calls it the notion that it's better for a child to walk than to roll, to speak than to sign, to read than print braille, or excuse me, to read print than to read braille, to spell independently rather than use a spell check, and etc. Basically, it's the uncritical assertion that the able way to do things is the preferred way, it's the better way. And so all of the efforts that we have, particularly in special education, are most often geared towards having students do things the way a student without a disability would do them, rather than doing it their own way. I'm showing you a little graphic here of an ad. It's from the Canadian Tire Company. And after you're done with this lecture, I would advise you to go watch it. It's a 1-minute ad. It's about a bunch of kids playing basketball. But you'll notice in that the effort is not to have one kid play it the same way everybody else does, but rather to change the game in such a way that everybody is able to play. It's sort of a version of universal design in which the student doesn't have to, or the kid in this case, doesn't have to emulate the way that his able-bodied peers do it, but they make the game work for everyone and do it differently in a way that's fun for all. So in general, Freire talks about this as the notion that to find freedom, people need to reject and eject the image and the guidelines and so forth that freedom has normally been given by the oppressor, and instead find their own, to trust themselves with their own autonomy and their own sense of responsibility. So in terms of curriculum, what does that look like? Okay, it really is, as we've discussed a bit, working from the world into the classroom. In essence, the curriculum begins with the students' lives. The students' lives are the text that we're learning. What's important to them, what's going on in their world. We've mentioned in other places that, right, students are learning machines, right? That's what they're doing. They're trying to figure out how the world works. So Freirean pedagogy takes that very seriously and makes that really the center of what we're about. The goal is to become powerful and to have a role in impacting the systems that affect them, okay? We've talked before about other pedagogies that understand the role of society and the role of the system. Excuse me. Freire is very much in that same mold, except that the key here is that the goal is for students to be able to impact those systems that affect them. To do that, he talks about problematizing, that the role of the curriculum is not simply to accept the world as it is, but to analyze it in terms of what's going on in this system, and then crafting an alternative. How could it be different? How could it be done differently in a way that emphasizes personal autonomy, collective responsibility, etc., in a way that is, in fact, liberating and powerful for the student. Altogether, this comes to be known as a critical pedagogy. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. A couple of the very important elements of critical pedagogy are what's known as praxis and as a dialogic method. So praxis is often understood as the interaction of theory and action, putting theory into play, into action. And it does begin with theory, okay? It does begin with taking a look at how things might be, but then it's the role in school to sit back and reflect on that, right? One of the nice things about school and about an educational enterprise is that we don't have to just jump right into what we're doing. We have the opportunity to sit, analyze, pull things apart, and figure out how else they might be. Having reflected thus, we take action in the world. We try to make things different, right? We try a new plan. We try to see how it could work. We then get to reflect again. How did that work, right? What was going on there? And in problematizing that, we come back to theory, right? We expand our understanding. We think about this in ways that try to generalize from the particular experience. So when we talked about earlier that the students' lives were the text that we were studying, it doesn't mean that our work is limited to the particular circumstances of students' lives, but that we use those as ways of generating theories about how the world does work and could work, and we take those experiences and we generalize them to others. That's the theorizing part of a praxis. Dialogic teaching, both between students and between teacher and student, is a central pedagogical technique in Freirean work. And Freire said about that, he said, I engage in dialogue not necessarily because I like the other person, right? This isn't strictly about um, creating those social bonds. But what it does come back to is some of the constructivist kinds of thinking that social and not merely individualistic character of the process of knowing is central. We construct meaning together. Okay, so in that sense, dialogue presents itself as, to Freire, an indispensable process of learning and knowing. It has to happen. We are going to be doing this work together. Knowledge is social. It is socially constructed. Okay, and so it's absolutely central. So what does a teacher do in this? If students' roles are the text, students' lives are the text, what is the role of the teacher if the dialogue is going on here again amongst the students? Well, you may have heard the idea of the contrast of sage on the stage versus guide on the side, right? Sage on the stage, you'll understand at this point, really represents the way that a banking concept of education would work, right? You've got a wise person in front of the group telling them what's important, telling them what to think. The guide on the side is doing much more of facilitating the learning in which students are active. You've heard us say in class a number of times that if school's working right, at the end of the day, the teachers should be energetic and the kids should be exhausted. Okay, that would be happening in a Freirean classroom. But they're not just there kind of as the referees of learning. They're there to problematize. They're there to push the learning, to say, well, gee, how do you understand what's going on there? Talk about that. Figure it out, analyze it together, and construct in a praxis model an alternative that they then guide toward action and then bring it back around to reflection further, okay, and more theorizing. So in going through all of these pieces, right, you've got people becoming more powerful about the questions and about the circumstances that affect their lives by studying their lives, learning from there about what they could do more broadly in the world and enhancing their sense of power, self-efficacy, and freedom. And that is the essence of a Freirean pedagogy. That was a very quick introduction, but I think it gives you an appropriate taste of it. Thanks very much.